Bennett Parten is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University, whose area of expertise is in the Civil War period. He is a native of Royston, Georgia, and completed his PhD in history at Yale. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Civil War Monitor, among others, and he currently lives in Savannah, Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bennett Parten.
Appreciate it. Well, thanks everyone for being here, especially on a Monday night. As I understand, Monday nights are kind of rare occurrences, so I appreciate you coming out. And I'll just say too, it's been a real pleasure to be here. I've had a chance to walk around the museum earlier. It's a fantastic museum, really impressive, and so it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I've enjoyed chatting with everyone as well beforehand, and I hope if I didn't get a chance to say hello, that afterwards we can chat real quick, and I'm really looking forward to meeting some of y'all. And so what I want to do tonight is really leave quite a bit of time to answer whatever questions y'all might have, but I do want to say a little bit about the book. And I think really the place maybe to start is just to say a little bit about where and how the book began. And as I've told folks, there's kind of a long story and then a shorter story. And the long story starts with the fact that I was born and raised in Royston, Georgia, which is about 20 miles north of Athens, Georgia. And every year, my family would get in the car, we would drive 4 or 5 hours to the coast, to Savannah, to Hilton Head, to Fripp Island, Jekyll Island, St. Simon's Island. And what's interesting about that is that for all of, except maybe the first 30 minutes, you are essentially on Sherman's route to the sea. You are passing through the same small towns, a lot of the same landscapes that look, I imagine, exactly like they would have looked like in 1864. And then when we got to the coast, as much as I loved to fish and play golf and sit on the beach, what I really loved to do more than anything, especially when I got my license, was just to drive around the low country, see islands, explore all those small towns. And so when it came time to write a dissertation project and begin to do a project like this, I think there was a part of me that always relished the idea that I was writing about two places that meant so much to me, my home state of Georgia, but also the Sea Islands. And so I think in some way, this book really began with some of those memories I have as a kid, making that long drive and then driving around the low country. And then now, coincidentally, I live in Savannah, and so I make that exact same drive over and over again to go visit my parents who still live outside of Athens, and then to go visit my wife's parents who live in Atlanta, which, again, follows almost the exact same route of Sherman's march to Savannah. So that's maybe the long story of how this book began, but the short story has to do with me reading Orca fiction. Do we have any Yale Doctorow fans in the audience? Maybe a couple. Has anyone read The March? Yeah, Doctorow to me is maybe our great historical fiction author. Probably best known for the book Ragtime, which is a book about America at the turn of the 20th century. It's a fantastic book. Love the book. But Doctorow also took on the Civil War and Sherman's March in a book called simply The March. And as was Doctorow's style and fashion, he included in this book a wide, almost kaleidoscopic range of characters. There is a deeply troubled German-born U.S. Army surgeon. There is a Southern debutante who is also deeply troubled, who becomes the sidekick and love interest to the surgeon. Kind of a strange story. There are 2 tragically comic Confederate prisoners of war that are included, and Sherman himself is a real character in this story. And then I should say there's many others as well. But Doctorow also included as a character a freed woman named Wilma Jones, freedwoman, formerly enslaved woman, who, as Sherman's army moves through Georgia, drops everything, runs to the army, and then follows the army all the way to Savannah. And you later learn that Jones is likely the mother, if not grandmother, to another character that appears in one of Doctorow's stories, but I won't go much further than that and spoil anything. In any case, as someone who's read about the Civil War, a student of history, someone from Georgia, I recognize that Jones probably wasn't a singular character, that in fact she was likely a composite character, and there were probably many hundreds, if not thousands, of Wilma Joneses and folks just like her traveling along behind Sherman's army. And so it struck me, or I began to question how we could tell the story of someone like Wilma Jones from a historical perspective rather than just the perspective of historical fiction. And in some ways, even when this project began, I always saw my mission as trying to write the kind of nonfiction companion piece to E.L. Doctorow's fictional work in The March. So that's how the story began. And you fast forward to now, that's what my book tries to do. It is, as its name suggests, it's a history of emancipation in the wake of Sherman's march through Georgia in 1864. And I'm able to tell this story in part because by the time Sherman arrives in Savannah in 1864, he speculates that there are as many as 20,000 freed refugees from slavery following his army to the coast. That's 20,000 Wilma Joneses, 20,000 people who dropped everything, fled to the army, and then followed the army all the way through Georgia to Savannah. And we should recognize that's an astounding number. Savannah, which was Georgia's largest city, only had a population of about 22,000 at the time. And then Atlanta only had a population of about 10,000. So this movement at the tail end of the army is a movement about the size of a large southern city. So what my book does that's new or novel, it breaks new ground, I suppose you could say, is that it puts this refugee movement at the very center of the traditional story of Sherman's March. That's what my book does most fundamentally. Now, many of you will perhaps not be surprised to know this is not how the story of the March has traditionally been told. Instead, for several generations now, historians have debated whether or not Sherman's tactics in Georgia birthed quote-unquote total war, meaning whether or not his tactics prefigured or presaged some of the fighting that would happen in Europe in the First and Second World Wars, Vietnam, and others. And the answer is that no, it didn't, not by a long shot. We can talk about that maybe in Q&A if we want to. But certainly for anyone who's seen the movie Gone with the Wind, you know the classic scene of that film, the lasting image of that film is the scene of Atlanta all ablaze. And I'll just say for myself, as someone from Georgia, there are still plenty of people who regard Sherman as something of a war criminal, as an enemy. And so our popular memory of this moment of the march has always been one that has privileged soldiers or Sherman, his cult of personality, the grievances of the white South. And we've always generally seen this moment as a purely military event. And it was, very much so, almost by definition. But the reality is that for enslaved people who experienced this march as well, the march was also much more than that. For them, it was a liberation event, or as I call it in the book, a freedom movement. And I mean it as such in a very literal sense, in the sense that this was a campaign that conquered the Confederacy, destroyed slavery. It was a campaign in which many tens of thousands of enslaved people experienced freedom, and a campaign in which as many as 20,000 people pursued freedom by doing just like Wilma Jones, by dropping everything, running to the army, and then following the army all the way to the coast. And if I can just flesh out this 20,000 number even further, that number doesn't take into account the people who might have run to the army and then turned back somewhere along the way. It doesn't take into account the people who might have run to the army and then were turned back by Sherman's soldiers. It doesn't take into account the amount of people who might have run to the army and then made the decision not to actually make this journey to wherever the heck the army was going. It doesn't take into account the many hundreds and thousands of people who experienced freedom just as a consequence of this campaign, which is where the book's subtitle comes in. When you take all these factors together, what you get is the largest emancipation event in American history, and a military campaign that did in effect and in reality what Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation only ever did on paper. And so I mean this in a very real and literal sense. But I also regard it as a freedom movement and try to imagine as such in the book in a perhaps somewhat more abstract sense. And what I mean by that is the reality of this movement was that it was so large that it, and especially its aftermath along the southern coastline, would go on to have an enormous impact on what Reconstruction would look like. Everything from the fate of land reform on the southern coastline to the shape of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the government's central agency for handling the transition from slavery to freedom, to, I would even argue, the very meaning of freedom itself, all have important plot points and storylines that point back to Sherman's march and its immediate aftermath. In fact, one of the things that I hope readers will see in this book is that the march was both one of the last campaigns of the Civil War, but also perhaps our first battle of Reconstruction. That's one of the ways that I try to imagine this moment and see this moment. And this points to what I think is perhaps maybe the biggest takeaway of the book and the biggest thing that this book is trying to suggest and argue, which is that yes, the march was a military campaign, it was a military event, but I also think it was a defining moment in the history of American freedom. Yes, it is a Civil War campaign, not unlike the Vicksburg campaign or the Antietam campaign, right? But I think it was also somewhat like Yorktown, Philadelphia in 1776, Lincoln at Gettysburg, Selma, Alabama. One of these moments in American history that have had enormous consequences for what American freedom actually means. So at the highest level, that is what this book tries to do, and that is what I'm trying to accomplish in it. But I also want to take a quick second to talk a little bit more about what happens in Georgia along the path of Sherman's march. And if I can just start at the beginning and offer a little bit of context. Sherman begins his march in mid-November of 1864. This is the last full year of the Civil War, though folks certainly did not know that at the time. The Confederacy in this moment is on the ropes. Lee's army in Virginia is pinned down at Petersburg, just south of Richmond. And Sherman's march comes after Sherman has taken Atlanta, which is a very important victory for a variety of different reasons. And so the march is Sherman's next move. It's a march of about 60,000 soldiers, covering about 250 miles, lasting about a month and a half. Except this wasn't exactly an ordinary campaign. I think many of you all probably know this. One of the things Sherman tried to do, or wanted to do, was to cut loose from his supply lines in Atlanta and forage off the farms and the fields of central and middle Georgia as a way of feeding and sustaining his army, but also as a way of targeting the emotional and material ability of white Southerners to continue keeping up the fight. And this, I should say, is something that Sherman was known for, especially by 1864. By the time the march begins, he is already a fierce advocate for a harsher, less restrained type of fighting. This is something for him that begins in Memphis in 1862 when he's the military governor. When he's there, he's tasked with dealing with the enormous problem of Confederate guerrillas who fire on his own soldiers and who, even more, fire on civilian ships plying up and down the Mississippi River. And so in retaliation, one of the things that Sherman decides to do is to send his own troops out to the towns and villages around Memphis that harbor these guerrillas and burn them, sometimes leaving nothing left standing except for one building, just so people knew where those villages were. It's a way of marking the spot. And then he also developed a policy in Memphis where he began expelling 10 local families for every shot fired on a ship or one of his men. And so this is really the kind of origins of Sherman's hard war philosophy. It's this experience in Memphis, as well as just this growing recognition that the army would need some of these harsher methods to actually win this war, that lays the groundwork for what's going to happen in Georgia and elsewhere. But that being said, Sherman was not indiscriminate. He always maintained that he wanted the foraging to be done, what he described as by the book. For example, he maintained that his men were only to forage enough food for about 10 days. He instructed his men not to enter into any homes. He instructed his men not to burn any homes, only barns and cotton houses, cotton facilities. He even encouraged less restraint when it came to rich planters and rich Georgians, on the assumption they were still keeping up the fight and could afford to lose a horse or a cow or two. But he urged real leniency when it came to poor Georgians, on the assumption that they had already given up the fight generally and could ill afford to lose a horse or two. So Sherman was hardly the kind of Genghis Khan character in blue that sometimes popular memory makes him out to be. But of course, even having said all that, all of these instructions went out the window if white Georgians fired upon any of his men. There were also groups of stragglers and bummers who traveled behind the army and certainly didn't pay any heed to his instructions. And we should face the reality, this is a movement of about 60,000 soldiers moving very quickly in the middle of a war zone. And so that's not to say that there weren't moments where things might have gotten out of hand. Yet the march itself was not quite the indiscriminate story that it is sometimes made out to be. But what's lost in this traditional story, usually, is that from the moment that the army shoved out of Atlanta, enslaved people began following the army in incredible numbers. I should say Sherman knew this would happen. He even included, as part of his official campaign orders, a set of instructions, or at least an order for what his men should do when enslaved people came into the lines. But it was really hardly an order at all. It was incredibly ambiguous, incredibly vague, and as became very evident as the march began, became woefully inadequate. Nonetheless, enslaved people could look up to the sky and see clouds of smoke of burning buildings and knew that the army was near at hand. As I said, pretty soon they began arriving at army lines in incredible numbers. Soldiers describe meeting whole families of enslaved people, groups as large as 100 or more. And in some cases, they describe entire communities leaving a plantation to come out and meet the army. Oftentimes, enslaved people would light up alongside roadsides. If you add in the amount of flags, the military bands, there were moments where the march looked like kind of military parade. On the plantations, however, things were a bit more complicated. Here on the farms and the estates of Middle Georgia and South Georgia, enslaved people often operated as a kind of third-party broker between the standoff between the army and Southern whites, and as brokers of their own emancipation. In fact, one of the consistent features of this story is that all through Georgia, enslaved people consistently acted as the army's allies. Enslaved people routinely offered military intelligence. Sherman would even meet with enslaved people to get a lay of the land. Sometimes he would ask specifically for enslaved people to understand what the landscape looked like and what roads to travel down. Enslaved people themselves piloted soldiers down footpaths, through trails in the woods. They would routinely shelter escaped Union prisoners from as far as Columbia, South Carolina, sheltering them several nights through woods, through the Georgia countryside, just to get back to the Army's lines. And the Army was always incredibly appreciative of this effort. And then maybe the best story is that because white families had a habit of hiding their foodstuffs, their livestock in advance of Sherman's men, but of course they themselves actually didn't do any of the hiding. They forced their enslaved people to do it. And so when the army arrived, it was enslaved people who routinely directed the army to where many of these corrals out in the woods had been hidden, where in the family cemetery these treasures had been buried. And they even would use this knowledge as bartering chips, as a bargaining device to find refuge with the army and to travel along. Another example, and maybe even a better example, is what happens when the army nears Savannah. There, the plantations are less abundant. This is sort of the rice swamps or the rice plantations north of Savannah. It's also where the terrain gets very swampy. There's a lot of rivers. The march moved much slower. And the foraging parties, for the first time ever, really came back with their hands empty, their arms empty. They didn't have nearly as much stuff, or were not returning with as much food as they were previously. But fortunately for them, enslaved people sustained them by teaching them how to husk and hull and prepare rice. Sherman's army of Midwesterners knew of rice, didn't eat a whole lot of rice. And they sure as heck didn't know how to use a mortar and pestle to husk it, and to hull it, and prepare it. But enslaved people did. And so in these kind of nervy few days outside of Savannah, when the army wasn't sure if they were going to finish this campaign or not, at least roughly probably half of Sherman's army were sustained by large numbers of enslaved people, teaching them how to cook and prepare rice. And so what these examples make clear is that all along the campaign, enslaved people acted as a kind of underlying force that propelled the army forward and helped push the army closer and closer to Savannah. And again, of course, I mean this in the sense that enslaved people were always there helping and aiding the army, acting as allies. Sherman had 4 columns through Georgia, and in a NPR interviewer I was talking to described enslaved people as Sherman's 5th column because they were always there helping the army. But I also mean this in a very literal sense that by the time the army arrives in Milledgeville, Georgia, which was the 19th century state capital and is about halfway through the march, there are already thousands of enslaved people waiting to follow Sherman's army to the coast. Before I move on to other topics, if I can leave you with one lasting image about what this march would have looked like, it's this, which is that some of the refugees who ran to the army were later employed as military pioneers, which this is a Civil War term essentially for manual military laborers. In normal times, these were people who would have done things like bury the dead, dig latrines, other forms of manual work that was required to sustain and keep an army moving. But in Georgia, on the march, they were road builders. And so they traveled out ahead of the army, which leaves us with this image of the fact that all through Georgia, out ahead of Sherman's men, there were scores of formerly enslaved people who were literally paving the road to Savannah and preparing the route for Sherman and his men. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about what is very much the darkest aspect of this history, which is a terrible betrayal that took place at a place called Ebenezer Creek, which is about 20 miles north of Savannah. And it involved one of Sherman's subordinates, a general named Jefferson Columbus Davis. And I want to specify, this is Jefferson Columbus Davis, not Jefferson Finis or F. Davis, the Confederate president. These are 2 totally different people. Though both have a well-earned reputation for infamy, I think, and we'll understand why. Davis's reputation actually goes back all the way to 1862, when he literally walked up to a fellow U.S. general, pulled a gun from his pocket, fired, and killed him in cold blood. They were arguing over a matter of personal offense, but funny enough, Davis never saw a trial. The fact is, this was 1862. There was a dire need for experienced soldiers, so Davis got off. He was completely freed, and he later joined Sherman's army outside of Atlanta. But in any case, Davis was the head of Sherman's 14th Corps. Sherman, after leaving Atlanta, he divided his army into 2 wings, a left and a right wing, and both wings were divided even further to 2 corps. So there were effectively 4 columns marching through Georgia. And if you know Georgia, the routes out of Atlanta followed essentially 75 south and 20 south before turning to go towards Savannah. But it's Davis's route that slopes closest to the Savannah River. Once he got to about the town of Millen, which is just south of Augusta, he began moving closer to the Savannah River and towards Savannah. And this mattered because his route was the swampiest. He had to cross the most rivers. And Davis was someone who did not like the fact that so many refugees were following his army. In fact, of all of Sherman's corps commanders, he was the only one that I found that specifically wrote Sherman essentially grousing about this, wanting to do something about the fact that so many refugees were following his army. And the methods that he devises to rid his lines of this crowd of refugees is that at around a place called Buckhead Creek, which is near Milledgeville, he begins pulling up temporary bridges before the refugees get a chance to cross. And this is a picture of what these bridges might have looked like. This is from Virginia, so it's not here in Georgia, but nonetheless is an example of what they would have looked like. But then he does it again. Maybe he does it again. We think that maybe 3 times before disaster strikes at Ebenezer Creek. And I should say Ebenezer Creek is called Ebenezer Creek, but this is a body of water that is much more than a creek. It is, as I said, about 20 miles north of Savannah. The crossing is probably maybe a third of a mile, maybe even less than that, to the Savannah River. So it's really a kind of bayou or one of these classic Georgia intercoastal waterways. It's a swamp. There's a heavy current because it's so close to the river, so close to the coast. And this time of year in December, the water level would have been high. So we're talking about a large body of water that's bigger than just a creek. But nonetheless, as I said, this is where disaster strikes. Davis tries his trick again. And just as soon as the army had lifted the temporary bridges, some reports say that he even burned them for good measure. A band of Confederate cavalrymen swung up from behind and barreled into the refugees who were stranded on the shore. Many of the freed people stranded on the bank immediately plunged in the water. Some ran up and down the water's edge, looking for some degree of shelter. There's reports that some tried to crawl under the bank for protection. Screams and shrieks and shots rang out of the river. And when it was all said and done, few ever managed to make it across the river at all. Many drowned in the current, and those left stranded on the opposite bank were either killed, captured, and re-enslaved. Now, we don't know actually how many freed people perished at Ebenezer Creek in the stream or how many people were captured by Wheeler's cavalry, but we do know that what happened at Ebenezer Creek was truly horrific. We also know that it represented a real turning point in this campaign. Many of Sherman's soldiers would write about the indignity of the event. They would damn Davis straight to hell. They took this as a real moment of shame for the army. They also saw this as a moment in which they recognized the lengths that enslaved people were willing to go to achieve freedom and to attain freedom. And then for the freed people themselves, this was also a turning point in the sense that they could never go back. If they were to try to cross the river, it would mean running right into Wheeler's cavalry. And many of them also wore the trauma of the crossing on the threads of their dampened clothes. Many of the soldiers would write that it was very clear that freed people who traveled as families before Ebenezer Creek continued making the march to Savannah, but in many cases, family members were no longer marching with them. So it's very clear that people lost loved ones in this moment. Ebenezer Creek was also a turning point because somehow word of the event got out. It's not clear how exactly. Some evidence suggests that some soldiers wrote their congressman or wrote the New York Times telling about what happened. But nonetheless, word did get out, and this is one reason why when Sherman arrives in Savannah in 1860, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton comes in January. And he's ostensibly there to inspect cotton supply that's in Savannah, but he also at one point pulls out a newspaper and asks Sherman about Ebenezer Creek directly. He wants to know what happened. Sherman plays it off. He doesn't want to answer it. He blames Davis, but then he says that Davis, his mind didn't do anything wrong. It's all hearsay. He tried to play down what happened. Nonetheless, Stanton wants an interview with 20 of Savannah's black religious leaders, the local leaders of the community there. And this meeting happens, sometimes known as the Savannah Colloquy. And it has to be one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the Civil War. As I said, it was organized principally by Stanton. And the topic of conversation that night was the Georgia freedmen, meaning that large group of refugees that had arrived outside of Savannah. Took place in the beautiful green mansion on Madison Square, which if you've been to Savannah, it's one of the beautiful homes that's now run by a local Presbyterian church on one of the squares there in Savannah. And in the meeting, the 20 religious leaders appoint a man named Garrison Frazier as their spokesman. This is a man who had bought his own freedom and his wife's freedom 10 years earlier, and who now found himself having an interview with 2 of the most powerful men in the country. And again, this meeting was essentially about what to do about the freed refugees that had followed the army to the coast. But the questions unfolded in a way in which the meeting became a kind of referendum on this civil war. It became a conversation about what freedom might mean and what people like Fraser and what the refugees could and want to expect from freedom. And Fraser's signature answer is land. He says that the best way for the refugees to take care of themselves and to make freedom mean something is to have land and the independence that comes with it. But most critically of all, and this is one of the things that I never knew about the story until I started digging into this, is that when Stanton asked Fraser how he had come about his opinions, he says, well, in my conversation with my peers, but also in my ministry to the refugees that have arrived here. Which I think is an astounding anecdote because it suggests that despite not actually being in the room, the refugees, through their sheer force of movement, nonetheless found a way to be in that room and to have people like Sherman and Stanton pay attention to their own wants and desires. Also, Fraser's answer is partly why just 4 days after the meeting with those religious leaders, Sherman issues what's known as a Special Field Orders number 15, which sets aside plantation land from Jacksonville in the south all the way to Charleston in the north for exclusively African-American homesteading. Sherman didn't see it as such. He viewed this order as purely expedient for his own men and for his own strategic purposes. But this was nonetheless the most dramatic escalation in Reconstruction policy to date, and a sign of just how radical Reconstruction could actually become. Suddenly, and for the first time ever, widespread land reform in the South moved to the forefront of debates of what post-war Reconstruction might look like. Now, I should say that these stories about what happens in Georgia, along with the story of Ebenezer Creek, all appear in the first half of the book. The second half focuses on the Army's time in Savannah, but most of all, it takes up the question of where the refugees went and what happened to them once they arrived on the coast. And the answer is that just as soon as Sherman arrived on the banks of the Ogeechee River in late December 1864, he begins a process of sending the refugees up the coast to the islands around Port Royal, South Carolina. You can see that depicted a little bit in my handy-dandy homemade map, which is a little more than a Google screenshot. And I should say, and I don't want to veer too far from the microphone, but it's the Ogeechee River, which is in the square at the bottom, not the Savannah River, that is the most important waterway for Sherman before the fall of Savannah. Fort McAllister is on the Ogeechee River, about right here. And so when Fort McAllister falls, this is what allows the Army to then move into Savannah. It tells Hardee, who's in Savannah, that there's no way that Savannah can be defended. So Fort McAllister's fall is really important. But then after Fort McAllister falls, Savannah falls, Sherman continues to use the Ogeechee as a depot and a base of operations because he can send ships down the Ogeechee, which can connect him to the Atlantic Ocean and then beyond. And I should say, too, that Port Royal is really important, which is a port just north of Savannah in the Sea Islands, because it is the deepest deep-water port on the southern coastline. And so as early as 1861, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army had targeted it as a place where they could then dock their ships as they blockaded Charleston and Savannah. But it's important for this story because as early as 1861, when the U.S. Navy arrives, the local white inhabitants evacuated. They took flight. And there were about 10,000 enslaved people left remaining on the islands. And these people were effectively free. But this is still 1861, long before an Emancipation Proclamation, long before a Second Confiscation Act. Some of these pieces of legislation that really forced the government's evolution to a war that would end slavery. And so what's devised there at Port Royal is a program known as the Port Royal Experiment, whereby teams of Northern missionaries, agents, philanthropists from Philadelphia, New York, Boston, as well as a few what I call plantation technocrats. These are middle manager, budding capitalist types. They come down to the islands, they build schools, they host school sessions, they build churches, they host Sunday schools. They also administer humanitarian aid. but they also convince, sometimes coerce, the freed people to go back to the cotton fields to work not as enslaved people, but as wage laborers. So this Port Royal experiment is meant to begin the transition from slavery to freedom. And again, begins in late 1864, early 1862, so very early in the war. But Sherman begins to send the refugees there in part because he knows that this infrastructure, this program is already there and already in place. So it's not surprising that Sherman would want to ship the refugees to Port Royal. The problem is that the 17,000 refugees that maybe make it there doubles the amount of free people that are currently on the islands. And it goes on to destabilize the work that was already underway. Rufus Saxton, the military governor of the islands, he warned Sherman that the islands simply didn't have the resources or the infrastructure to facilitate this movement of people. Sherman was sympathetic, we know, but nonetheless, it continued. The refugees began arriving Christmas 1864. And so what happens is that Sherman's decision to move the refugees to Port Royal from the Ogeechee up to, as I said, Port Royal, it turns what was a self-contained colony into the epicenter of a sprawling refugee crisis. First of all, the movement down the Ogeechee up to Port Royal represented yet another refugee experience, another set of nights sleeping out in the cold, which led to profound sickness from exposure. And though food wasn't initially an issue, by February and March of 1865, there would be serious food shortages on the islands. Saxon, as he had warned Sherman all along, also ran out of space. They ran out of places to our homes. And so it led to the construction of essentially refugee camps on the islands. It also led to real efforts to settle islands further away from Port Royal, places like Defusky, which is just on the other side of Tybee Island, there in Georgia, Edisto Island, and others. Basically anywhere you could find room, the Port Royal experiment began to expand because of the arrival of the refugees. Not only that, but by the late summer and early fall of 1865, mere months after the end of the war, land reform on these islands are already beginning to fail. Ex-Confederates are having their land restored, in part because Andrew Johnson was such a scoundrel and viewed pardoning ex-Confederates as being tantamount to having one's property restored. Land reform in these areas begin to fail. The promise of Sherman's special field order begins to fade. And this is when and where the refugee movement of Sherman's March begins to come to an end. With the promise of land evaporating, and as these refugees are caught up in this sprawling refugee crisis, many of the men and women who followed Sherman to Savannah and then were transported to the coast, to the Sea Islands, simply make the decision to return home. They begin making another long march back to Georgia, and this is where the book ends. And it ends with a moment, admittedly, of ambiguity. While Sherman's March represented the largest emancipation event in American history and a foundational moment in the shaping of American freedom, so I would suggest or argue, it, like so much of the Civil War, is also a story that, in its aftermath, went unfulfilled.